in charge. All right. Thank you very much, Anka, for the invitation to come here and give this presentation. And thank you to all of you for coming. I really appreciate you all coming to listen to this presentation, which is going to be a pretty high-level presentation. I decided to go more for breadth than depth. So I'm going to be covering a number of papers, a number of topics, really just primarily 2 projects, one of which had a tremendously big scope. And so before I jump into that, I just wanted to mention that this is everything I'm going to present is collaboration with someone somewhere. I very rarely work with myself. So here's me at Sandia. A bunch of folks that I work with at Sandia, some I've worked with for many years, like John and Dennis, and some I've worked with more recently, Becca and Sandia. My longtime collaborator, Troy Butler from University of Colorado, and some of his students who've done internships with me at Sandia, or we've collaborated on papers, and of course Anka from Sorbonne. Tam Bowie and one of his students, Brad from University of Texas, and then Michael and Lucas from TU Munich. Although I think I actually removed the slides they contributed to, but they've been longtime collaborators as well. Okay, so here's the outline for my presentation. So I'm gonna start off by giving you a little bit of an introduction to not to me but to Sandia National Labs. I don't necessarily assume that everyone has even heard of Sandia National Labs or what the national labs are like in the United States. And then I'll give a little bit of motivation for some of this research. And then I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit of an oddball. It doesn't quite fit with the rest of it, but I like talking about it. Optimal design of metamaterials and control of electromagnetics. And then we'll really jump into the heart of the presentation, which is going to be on solving stochastic inverse problems and what we call data consistent inversion. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Then we'll go into, I'll talk about how we, from a theoretical perspective, how we can incorporate sequences of approximate models and what we can say in terms of convergence of the solution to inverse problems when we have a sequence of converging approximate models, and as well as surrogate models that are adaptive over the stochastic space. Then I'll go into some very recent work where we've taken our data consistent inversion framework and combined it with Bayesian inference in the context of constructing population-informed priors for digital twins, and I'll explain that a lot more when we get there. Then I'll talk about something that's really heavy in notation. I'll try to describe it mostly through pictures. There'll be notations and equations and stuff, but optimal experimental design for prediction, and then I'll do the conclusion. Okay, so introduction. So if you're not familiar with the national lab system in the United States, the labs have been around for quite some time. And you probably can't read any of this, but what's important is how expansive the system is and how prestigious it is. They are considered the crown jewels of our research infrastructure. The U.S. government puts a tremendous amount of funding towards fundamental research and development at these national labs. What's important is that there's 17 of them. Of those 17, there's really 6 big ones, and there's 8 multi-purpose labs. The 6 big ones are really Argonne, Lawrence Berkeley, Lawrence Livermore, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Sandia. Pacific Northwest and Brookhaven are also multi-purpose. Sandia National Labs is unique in the sense that it's the one national lab, I think it's the only one, yes it is, that has 2 sites. There's the Albuquerque, New Mexico site and then the California site. I am in the New Mexico site. Okay, Sandia actually started in the late 40s. This chart only goes to the 50s, but it really started as the engineering laboratory to service Los Alamos for the nuclear weapons complex in the United States. So that's what we're primarily doing in the 50s. Throughout the decades, you can see the NW, which is nuclear weapons, program has been prevalent throughout our history. But you'll notice that when we start getting into the 1990s, when we decided we were no longer going to do nuclear weapons testing, we were just going to use modeling and simulation to certify our stockpile, we started to get a little bit more diverse. We started to do some more things with DoD. When 9/11 happened, we had a lot more nuclear or security applications. And nowadays, we're considered a multi-mission lab, and less than half of our funding is actually associated with nuclear weapons. We do a lot of work on climate modeling, materials modeling. You'll see some additive manufacturing pop up here, plasma physics simulations, which are related to weapons in a way. But we're much more diverse than we were in the 50s. As I mentioned before, Sandia National Labs has 2 main facilities. The big one is this here. You can't see the building where I work, but this is a picture of Sandia in New Mexico. There's also a sister site in Livermore, California, right next to Lawrence, Livermore, California. It's no coincidence. We also have what we call activity locations. I've never been to any of these, unfortunately. We have one in Hawaii, which I keep trying to figure out how I can get myself invited to. There's the waste isolation plant in Carlsbad, a site in Texas, and another place in Nevada. So that's kind of an introduction to the lab system in the U.S. as well as Sandia. Okay, so this is when I start the motivation for this actual presentation. So these are some of the applications. You'll see 2 of these. It'll come up in later slides. These are some of the applications that I've worked on in my 13 years at Sandia. A long time ago, I was doing uncertainty quantification for climate modeling. I've done a lot of work on multi-scale materials modeling. This is actually not going to appear in this presentation. We've done work on tokamak equilibriums. This is just an MHD, a steady-state MHD simulation. And then more recently, we've been doing a lot of electromagnetic wave propagation for metamaterials and meta-optics, and I'll talk about that shortly. But for all of these applications, all of these are fairly complex physics models, most of which require what we call leadership class computational resources, meaning a big supercomputer. But even though each evaluation of these models is quite expensive, we are interested in moving beyond forward simulation for all of these applications. Now, what do I mean when I say beyond forward simulation? This is a cartoon that I put in most of my presentations because most of the stuff I work on fits somewhere in here. You'll see different versions of this appearing throughout my presentation as I'm talking about different things. So the models you saw on the previous slide really fit in here, but each of those models is subject to certain uncertainties. Maybe you have parametric uncertainties, maybe you just don't know your inputs or your forcings, or maybe you're making different modeling assumptions. And oftentimes what we try to do when we talk about beyond forward simulation, we're talking about things like optimization or inversion or data assimilation or even just uncertainty quantification. It could be forward or inverse propagation is what we mean by beyond forward simulation. So you have some sort of observed data and you want to use that observed data to inform or better characterize your inputs. You can say calibrate or solve an inverse problem, calibrate the parameters or inputs so that you can make better predictions using your computational model on things you can't observe directly. You can imagine that when we stop testing the nuclear weapons, we have data that we can utilize, but the things now that we need to predict, we can't collect data on. So this is actually tremendously important for the national lab. So I usually like to say we like to make data-informed physics-based predictions, or we want to enable that. Okay, the first part of my talk is going to focus on inverse problems, or optimal control, design, and inverse problems. And then we'll come to making predictions later. All right, so let's talk about optimal design of metamaterials and control of electromagnetics. So this is kind of a side topic. This is one of the two projects. The rest is mostly on the other project. This is a project I've worked on for several years, and it's been very fun. So I'm going to start by talking about optimal control, and then I'll talk about optimal design. Optimal control is actually much easier. So for optimal control, what we want to do is we want to find a current or some sort of electromagnetic source that we can generate to hide other electromagnetic sources. We want to be able to do this with arbitrary control shapes, meaning we want to be able to generate arbitrary currents. Really, what this involves is space-time PD constrained optimization. There's lots of applications of this. I'm not going to list them. Some are more complicated than others. In general, the optimization formulation looks something like this. You have some objective function, some loss function you want to minimize. Maybe you have target electric and magnetic fields that you want to match. These norms are basically normalized by certain parameters in the problem, and you have some sort of regularization term. So this is a pretty standard optimization, L2 type optimization formulations, and then this PD constraint, so you're subject to just simply Maxwell's equations, so Ampere's law and Faraday's law, with appropriate initial and boundary conditions. Okay. How do we actually discretize Maxwell's equations? Well, this is an important point, actually. A lot of the problems we look at, we're dealing with geometries that are very complex, and so we need to be able to handle non-uniform or arbitrary meshes, which means if we're doing a finite element discretization, we have to use what we call physics-compatible discretizations. The other way in which people describe this is discretizations that satisfy a discrete de Broglie complex. So de Broglie complex has a certain notion in the continuous space, and we want to preserve that structure in the discrete spaces, which means that if our finite element discretizations are going to preserve the structure, we need to use Ravier-Thomas elements and Nedelec elements for either the electromagnetic or electric or magnetic field. Most of what I'm going to show you is actually first order, meaning basically piecewise linear. But we also oftentimes, and more recently, we do a lot of high order extensions. So it's arbitrary. The codes are all arbitrary order. When you deal with Maxwell's equations, there's preserving the spatial structure, but there's also preserving the Hamiltonian structure through symplectic time integration. So most of what I'm going to show you was done using explicit symplectic methods, but we do implicit ones as well. So the computational framework that we put together really combines two packages. One is mine, Mr. Hyde, which is really designed for something else. It was designed to do concurrent multi-scale materials modeling and subsurface modeling. But we also use it for electromagnetics. It uses Trilinos, which is a relatively large C++ library developed at Sandia. This is the link down here for my code. If you go to github.com/Sandia Labs, you can find things like Trilinos and Cocos and approximately 600 other packages that make us put everything in. Mr. Hyde's there too. We also utilize the rapid optimization library to do scalable, large-scale PD constraint optimization. Okay. So I just want to give you a demonstration of hiding something. Right, this is kind of just a cool toy problem that we put together. I can't show you the actual problems that we are interested in doing. You might be able to guess why. Here's what we're going to do. We have this. This is a very crude approximation of the Sandia Thunderbird. It's a logo we have for our lab. This is something that Dennis kind of put together. He's very good at doing this. I can't do this that well. But in this green region, we're going to have some sort of electromagnetic source that's going to be pulsing. It's going to be oscillating. And we want to hide it in the yellow region. So we're okay if it's present in the gray region, but we want to hide it from the yellow region so that outside observers can't see it. And we're going to hide it by having these by optimizing for space-time controls within these four rods here. Okay. This is a video, and I think I'll have to click on it. Yeah. Okay. It's a little bit faint, but you can see what happens. Here's the actual current, the source. And this is the magnitude of the electric field. There's PMLs on the outside, so it just all goes away. But you can see what happens. If you don't do any controls, you just let the Thunderbird radiate. That's the kind of electromagnetic pattern that you see. But when we do our PD constraint optimization, you can see that now, if you look at this is the uncontrolled and this is the controlled simulation. It's completely hidden from the outside. if you look here, you can see the space-time controls. They're actually quite complicated. And there's actually two other observations you can make. When you're doing the space-time PD constrained optimization, your controls to hide the source actually have to get started before the source gets going, because it needs to get ahead of it. And when it stops, obviously we only run for the finite time. If we were to keep running after this, it would leak out if we didn't have any sort of control afterwards, after a certain time. Okay, so those are just fun problems. We can hide certain things given enough power to do it. But really, what we were interested in this project is optimal design of metamaterial. So optimal control and optimal design. This is the same problem, just it's still Maxwell's equation. But what we want to do is design electromagnetic devices with nanoscale structures. So you can see each of these pillars here are associated with what's called the unit cell. So this is just a bunch of little cubes put together in a certain pattern. These are simply different materials, and it's extremely thin. So there's just the thickness of this this wafer is actually submicron. And so what we want, the reason why people are interested in this is because if you can design a metamaterial like this that can have the focusing power of a conventional lens, then one, you can make them very big, and they'll still be relatively lightweight. And two, again, the size and the weight matters, so we can put them into night vision goggles so that they won't have as much of a torque on the neck for the person who's wearing it. So this is actually what we were doing. The Defense Department was giving us some funding to help them design the next generation of night vision goggles using these metamaterials. So you can see here, this is actually a movie, but I'm not going to play it. But this is the optical stack, where you have an eyepiece here. The meta surface is somewhere in the middle. So this actually, when we run simulations, we get information from another code that is ray tracing. We do a whole bunch of inhomogeneous wave propagation, and then we send it to another code. The problem here, so this is actually very simple. This is just basic electromagnetic wave propagation through a heterogeneous medium. It's just Maxwell's equation. It's not that complicated. The problem is the scale of the problem. We want to do this in the visible range, so with visible light, and we want to do this with lenses that are practical, which means if you want to do a 10 centimeter diameter meta lens for a certain wavelength, this would require about 160 billion of these unit cells. Each of those unit cells has a fair number of finite elements. You actually have to resolve the structure. So if we were to do a fully resolved model, it would require about 800 trillion elements. It's a little bit beyond our capabilities right now. We can do 800 billion, but we can't do 800 trillion. So we can't quite get to where we want to be, but we're getting closer. This is what an actual simulation looks like. It's a little bit hard to see. But this entire metamaterial here is basically, it's right at the starting point here. And you can see it affects the waves as it propagates through. If I were to let this run out, there would be a focal point down here, which it would focus the electromagnetic energy. The point here is that this is a very powerful technique. It's this capability, this large-scale electromagnetic modeling and simulation capability, and the associated optimal design of these metamaterials is part of a bigger project called Meta Optics Studio, and we were happy to see we won an R&D 100 award last year. So R&D 100 is this thing we have in the U.S. That goes out, it gives 100 awards to like the most promising innovations in R&D that year. And so we were able to get one for this last year. Okay. That's just fun stuff I like talking about. So let's dive into solving stochastic inverse problems and what I mean by data consistent inversions. I haven't actually described that yet. All right. Some of this is motivated by additive manufacturing, and some of it's motivated by digital twins for similar reasons, actually. Each of these applications. So this is additive manufacturing. This is a lens type, a laser. Put powder down and the laser melts it, and it creates additive metal structures. At Sandia, we don't make, well, we do make exciting things, but we don't tell people about those. We make a lot of boring things too. These are just little dog bones that we make, mostly for tensile testing. Because one of the things that, even if you're familiar with additive manufacturing, one of the things you might not be aware of is that the material properties associated with these components that are built using additive manufacturing are actually pretty different than using standard manufacturing techniques. And in fact, when you make something like this that has like, I don't know, 100 or so of these things on a plate, there's actually quite a bit of variability of the effective material properties over this, depending upon how the laser went across it. So you have things like remelting and all of that. So there's all sorts of new data science challenges associated with it. All right, so let's talk, now that we have that motivated a little bit, let's talk more about different types of inverse problems you might be interested in solving. So this is the classic one. This is actually what I was talking about before. You have some data, you want to find the parameters that best match the data. Okay, I refer to this as a deterministic inverse problem. Pretty straightforward, standard PD constrained optimization. Again, solutions with an inverse problem. Solutions may not be unique without making additional assumptions. Usually that involves some sort of Tikhonov type regularization. Doesn't have to be Tikhonov, but usually some sort of regularization helps you to impose some sort of stability. And requires solving a bunch of deterministic forward problems to find the best parameters. Okay. You can generalize this a little bit and define a stochastic inverse problem where you have, okay, I have my data here, I have my model, and I have some noise that's associated with the measurements, and I want to find the parameters that are most likely to have produced the data. Okay, this is basically meant to characterize Bayesian methods, although you should be a little careful about what you mean by most likely to have produced the data, but at least you get the idea. So in a Bayesian context, again, solutions may not be unique without additional assumptions. That's where you bring in prior information. There's a nice correlation between a prior for Bayesian inference and Tikhonov regularization for deterministic optimization. So these are very well connected. And I'll come back to that later, actually. But again, you have to solve a lot of deterministic forward problems. There's another inverse problem, and this is really the one I'm going to be talking about. So those problems that I described before, deterministic optimization, Bayesian inversion, are really most appropriate for characterizing epistemic uncertainties, meaning things you just don't know. If you collected enough data, you could converge. That's best done for an individual of these dog bone structures, or any sort of individual from a population. What if you're interested in a different question? What if instead of trying to characterize the parameters of an individual, what if you wanted to understand the distribution of those parameters over the entire population? So like I said, there's quite a bit of variability over this set of dog bone structures. Can we find the distribution of material properties that's consistent with the distribution of observations that we make over this population? So it's different. It's a different inverse problem. What you're saying is I have some sort of observed probability measure on my outputs, and I want to find a probability measure or density on my inputs such that when I propagate it through my model, I match my target or observed distribution. Okay? In some sense, you have a probability measure here. You want to construct a pullback probability measure on your parameter space. Again, this is an inverse problem. Solutions may not be unique without additional assumptions. We're going to do something very similar to what you would do in the other cases, where we're going to regularize the problem in certain ways by injecting prior or initial information. And we're going to have to solve a stochastic forward problem to do this. Okay, so let's go into a little bit of notation. Suppose we have a parameter space. It doesn't have to be finite dimensional, but we haven't published the infinite dimensional extensions yet. So suppose you have some sort of parameter space lambda. We have a parameter to observation map, Q, which just maps parameters to whatever we can observe. We have an observed or target probability measure. So I use those interchangeably. So if you're observing actual data, then maybe it's observed. Sometimes you just want to say, what's the probability measure, what's the pullback measure associated with a Gaussian or a uniform or something. So in that case, it's a target. Well, we assume we're given this on the output, and we're going to assume we have an initial probability measure on the input. You can think of this as being very similar to a prior in Bayesian inference. In fact, we called it a prior in our first paper. And then people complained because it's fundamentally different objects. It characterizes aleatoric versus epistemic uncertainty. So we changed it to use a synonym. So we call it initial now. Okay. What are we going to need to do? Well, one way to construct a pullback measure is to construct a push forward measure and reweight. That's basically what we're doing. So we're going to need to compute the push forward of the initial density through the model. This is just a forward UQ problem. You generate samples from your initial probability measure, evaluate your model, approximate the push forward density. That's all we need to do, and we can solve this inverse problem. Okay? We're going to use the subscripts on the densities indicate what space they're in, and then we're going to use predicted, just abbreviated pred, to denote this push forward density. Okay, so this is our initial prediction. We do have to make an assumption. This is not actually specific to our approach for solving this inverse problem. This is really more about the existence of a solution to this inverse problem. Remember, this is an inverse problem that's opposed. So one of you might have a better way of finding a solution. That's fine. We have a way. Ours is fine too. But no matter what, if you don't satisfy this assumption, then there does not exist a solution to this inverse problem. And it has to do with absolute continuity of measures. So you need that the observed measure is absolutely continuous with respect to the push forward of the initial. Okay? You cannot expect to predict all your data if your model is just not capable of it. Okay? So here you can see, here's my observed probability measure, and here's what my model is predicting. There's no way I can, if my model can only predict this over here, there's no way I can get it to predict things over here. Now that may be due to model form error or something else. But this is bad. This is better. So our observed is here in red, and our initial prediction here is in black. You can think of it as the black covers the red. Okay? In practice, we actually make a slightly stronger assumption than this. We assume that the radon-Nikodym derivatives associated with these two measures are finite, which implies this absolute continuity of measures, but the things that are in between are sometimes interesting too. I'm not going to talk about that. But, all right. So we're given an initial probability measure, an observed measure on our output space, and if we satisfy what we call that predictability assumption, then this probability measure defined by this really complicated iterated integral that I'm not really going to fully explain solves the inverse problem. Okay? This integral really isn't that complicated. It's really just Fubini's theorem rewritten in a certain way. Normally you think of Fubini's theorem as you integrate one direction then the other. This is really just integrating with respect to the directions informed by the push forward. So it's really not much more complicated than that, but it's something that's really important for constructing disintegrations of measures in this case. This is based on disintegration theorem. We can prove some things associated with this. The updated measure is 1, so it's a probability measure. We can prove it's a probability measure on the Borel-Segment algebra, so that's all good. We can also prove that it's stable with respect to perturbations in the observed density and in the initial. So that's important. We have our predictability assumption gives us existence. Up to the choice of initial probability measure, we had uniqueness, and we also have stability. Okay, for our inverse problem. This is all contained in a paper we published in 2018. Okay. But even though this looks messy, we're going to simplify it quite a bit, because this is the only object we really need to worry about. We never have to approximate these complicated iterated integrals, which involve like generalized contours in the input space. It's really complicated. All we need to do is look at this density. That density, which we call the updated density, is the initial times some ratio. Okay? That ratio is just the ratio of the observed with respect to the predicted. The predictability assumption guarantees I'm not divided by 0. So both the initial and the observed density are given. We assume they're given to us. They may have errors, but at least we have them on hand. We can either evaluate them or generate samples from them. And the predicted density requires solving a forward loop problem. Okay, so let me give you an example and walk you through kind of how this works. It really only takes 8 to 10 lines in Python to do all this. But it's relatively interesting. But don't worry too much about what the example is. I just leave it in there. We have 2 inputs and 1 output, and we have some sort of a nonlinear map. Okay, so this is going to be opposed because we only have it's a non-invertible map. We're going to assume a normal density for the observed and a uniform initial density. Generate some samples. Use a standard Gaussian KDE, Wikipedia level. Just Python can do it in 1 line. Okay, there's nothing hiding anything here. And then we'll use standard rejection sampling to generate samples from the updated density. That's not necessary, but I like to show it because I think it's intuitive. So here's our samples from our initial. We propagate them through our model. We get this push forward to the initial. That's our predicted density. Here's our observed density. You see they don't match. They weren't supposed to. These 3 things come together. Remember, it's the initial times that ratio of these 2 things to give the updated density, which now looks like this. This is colored by the values of the density. Then you can then utilize that. You do rejection sampling. You get samples roughly where you think you would get samples. Then you take those samples and propagate them through your model, and lo and behold, you have another curve on this plot. The blue is the push forward of the initial, so the initial prediction. The orange is the observed. So the blue and the orange didn't match. They weren't supposed to. But the push forward of this updated density of these samples matches the orange as we claimed it would. Okay. Let's look at another example, something just a little bit more interesting. This is a bit more this is higher dimensional. So this is the standard elliptic problem where you have some sort of permeability field that's log transformed and described by a finite or truncated KL expansion. So we're going to keep 100 terms, meaning we have 100 parameters. We're only going to have one observation we're going to use here. So you can see here's a few realizations. There's permeability, we have the pressure, and then generate samples, and we have, this is our quantity of interest, some sort of probability density function. The quantity of interest is just it's actually a mollified value of the pressure near some point. We use a certain number of samples, and again, just a KDE. And we assume that the observed density is given by some normal. So again, we have the observed here. We have the push forward of the initial. They don't match. Okay. We solve the inverse problem. And then you can ask the question, well, how do I know I solved the inverse problem? How do I know, what can I say about my solution? This is intentionally an eye chart because these are the one-dimensional marginals in a 100-dimensional space. So initially, everything was Gaussian. So that's the way KL expansions work. And after you solve this inverse problem, sort of non-Gaussian, it's a little bit it's actually it's non-Gaussian in this case because it's nonlinear math. But you can't really tell much. That's the point. I can't really tell you by looking at one-dimensional marginals, I can't tell you a whole lot about the solution to this inverse problem in my 100-dimensional input space. What I can tell you is that if I generate samples from that updated distribution, propagate them through my model, that will generate this black curve, which will match my observed distribution. That's how I qualitatively verify that I've solved the inverse problem. You can also quantitatively verify this. So our observed had a given mean and variance. The push forward of the updated has, within Monte Carlo sampling error, pretty good mean and variance. We also know that the integral of the updated density should be 1. The integral of the updated density is really just the integral of that ratio with respect to the initial. You're generating samples from the initial, so just take the mean of your ratio, and you should get something that's close to 1. Here we do. If you don't, what does that mean? It means you probably violated your predictability assumption and couldn't predict all your data. So this is actually a very useful diagnostic to validate when your predictability assumption is true. Now, it doesn't tell you how to fix it. It just tells you when something went wrong. And then it's up to you to figure out what went wrong. Maybe your model is predicting data over here and your observations are over here. Maybe it's significant model form error. I don't know. You can also do things like estimate the KL divergence, any F divergence actually, using this ratio. So these values of R are actually very useful. So we do all sorts of things. Okay. At this point, you're probably asking, how is this different from Bayesian inference? Okay. It's actually pretty different. I'll show you an example where they're exactly the same. And then it's the only example, actually. So it's useful to show. All right, so the standard Bayesian posterior, and then, any reference, we all know this, is I'm going to say the initial is the same as the prior, just to make comparisons. Times a different ratio. Right? It's the likelihood divided by the evidence, which is the integral of the likelihood with respect to the prior or the initial case. Let's look at 2 examples. Very simple, one-dimensional example. My quantity of interest is lambda to the p. Lambda is my uncertain parameter. P is either 1 or 5, depending upon if I want the model to be linear or nonlinear. Okay? So just 2 different examples. All right. We're going to assume a uniform initial and a given observed, and we're going to define the likelihood so that it's as close to the observed as possible. Okay? That's really the All right. So what happens? We have a linear map, p equals 1. Now I have a linear map and a uniform distribution in 1 dimension. The push forward of that is uniform. Higher dimensions it's not, but in 1 dimension it is. So what happens is, because your push forward of the initial is a constant, it has to be the same constant as Bayesian inference. So this is a KDE of a constant, approximation of a constant. But the push forward of the prior or the initial is in blue. The observed is in red, and the push forward of both the updated density from data conversion and the Bayesian posterior match the observed, just in this case. Oh, if and only if the push forward of the initial is a uniform distribution or constant. Okay? Because if you go to a nonlinear map, the whole story changes. Okay? Our observed distribution is in red. The push forward of the prior or the initial is in blue. The push forward of the updated density is in black, and it, for the most part, matches the red as it's supposed to. The push forward of the Bayesian posterior is in green. And it's some combination of the prior information and the observed data. So at this point, I get to ask, which one is right? I won't make you think about it too long, because the answer is they both are. They're solving different problems. So they're going to give different answers, and therefore make different predictions. But neither one's wrong. Just they're both doing exactly what they were supposed to do. They're just different tools that solve different problems. So that's the point. Okay. There's also some interesting connections you can make with deterministic optimization. I said I was going to come back to this. So you can characterize the updated density in terms of a data mismatch term and a Tikhonov regularization term, just like you would in Bayesian inference. I'm going through this quickly. If you're familiar with this, you've seen this is exactly what you've seen before. Except I have an additional term that I call an unregularization term. That unregularization term pops up because I'm not dividing by a constant in my ratio like in Bayesian inference. I'm dividing by a probability density. And so that's going to give me this minus sign and this unregularization term. So if we define the maximum updated density, the mud point, as being the point that maximizes the updated density, that minimizes this j, where j is this thing in the exponential. You can see it here. We can make a couple of observations. So if we rewrite the regularization terms like this, you can just kind of write this out. This is just a little bit of linear algebra, and you get this regularization matrix. Okay? One thing that's interesting to note, you can just kind of eyeball this. If A is invertible, you use the star, you can think of it as a transpose if you like. So infinite dimensionally, if you're careful. But if A is invertible, you just kind of do the math in your head, and you can realize this whole thing here is going to reduce to the inverse of the initial. You have inverse of the initial minus the inverse of the initial, meaning regularization gets completely turned off if there's a unique solution, which makes sense. If you have a one-to-one map, the pullback measure should be unique. More generally, that's not the case, but you can show that the regularization only gets applied in directions not informed by the map of the data. Let me just show you this in picture. Here's an example. Here's our data mismatch. This is a linear 2-to-1 map, so this is just a linear map. The black line is actually where the data mismatch is minimized. It's the line, not a point, because it's a no-place problem. So you apply some sort of regularization to it, and you get some sort of objective function, and if you were to solve an optimization problem, you'd find the point there in red. That's what it would do. If you find the mud point, we have the same data mismatch term, but now we have this modified regularization term. You can see it was the Tikhonov minus something. And that minus something removed the regularization and the directions informed by the data. The directions informed by the data are this way. So now regularization is only on this manifold, and you can see if you solve an optimization problem associated with this objective function, you would find a point that actually lies on the data mismatch manifold. You can prove this, at least for linear math. Linear Gaussian, you can prove this, otherwise you can't. Okay. I just find this intuitive and interesting. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about utilizing approximate and adaptive surrogate models. So why do we care about approximate models? Because every single thing I deal with is approximate. Okay? All of these models, no matter how expensive they all have some sort of approximations or model form errors or something. And they're all computationally expensive. So I can only afford maybe a dozen, a few hundred evaluations of the highest fidelity model. Maybe I need to bring in some sort of lower fidelity model that has some additional forms of approximation. So a reasonable question is, if I construct my updated density using an approximate model, you can just kind of write down what this is. Can I guarantee that that's even remotely close to my true updated density? Turns out, this is a very complicated question to answer, because you're saying, when does convergence in a certain notion imply convergence of probability density? So what you're really looking for is a converse of Sheffy's theorem, which is not necessarily true. So you have to make certain assumptions about the boundedness, and there's a very specific notion of continuity you need to make about these maps. I'm not getting into it here. Both of these papers It contain about 20 pages of numerical analysis, and I'm summarizing them in 2 sentences because the details are really hard to talk through. It would take me most of the time just to talk through these details. The point is, in this paper in 2018, we showed that if the approximate maps converge in L infinity, then the updated densities converge in L1. That was the easy case. We were able to generalize that a few years later. That was hard to show that if your approximate maps converge in LP, like a polynomial chaos converges in L2, then your updated densities also converge in LP. I think that can actually be L2. Okay. Both those results were difficult to obtain, but very useful. So here's just an example to show you that this actually does work. We have a particular two-dimensional input space, some sort of initial density. Our quantity of interest is just some function of just a bunch of Gaussian peaks put together. We're going to construct a sparse grid using Glenshaw-Curtis points, and then we're going to generate samples from the initial and evaluate the sparse grid and see what happens. Here's what the actual solution looks like. A level 2 sparse grid is not so great; it completely misses this here. Level 4 sparse grid is doing pretty well. So the approximations we have here are sparse grid surrogates. Also a kernel density estimator, but I'm not going to show you the errors associated with that. When you go to solve the inverse problem associated with a given observed density, here's the true solution to the inverse problem. You can see it, well, I was showing you Gaussian things earlier. This is highly non-Gaussian. It looks like some sort of disease of some sort. If you use a level 2 sparse grid, the solution to the inverse problem is not really that close, right? And the samples that you would generate are not really that close. The predictions you'd make are not really that close. By the time you get to level 4 sparse grid, doing a better job. We went up to 8 and 16, of course. And you can make plots like this that show as the L infinity error and the map, given in by the red, converges, the L1 error and the updated density also converges in a similar way. Okay. There's some sort of constant in there that I haven't even tried to estimate. Okay. Another question that we struggled with actually for a while was, can we develop adaptive surrogate models for problems where we have where adaptivity over the parameter space would be helpful, meaning maybe there's a hard to resolve feature like a discontinuity over the parameter space. So this was actually kind of difficult for a while, and then with a collaboration with Anka and Jean-Camille and Hector, we were able to put this together. The main idea is to combine this DCI framework with an adaptive simplex stochastic collocation method for CFD problems with where the shocks in the CFD solution induce discontinuities over your parameter space for certain quantities of interest. The adaptive surrogate model is driven by an error indicator based on an approximation of the interpolation error, and we were able to generate adaptive anisotropic meshes by solving a budget-constrained stochastic optimization problem. And the manuscript just appeared in IJUQ. Here's an example that we did. Really, Hector and Anka did. This is Euler equations in 2D. The input parameters are the free stream Mach number and the angle of attack. And we have 2 different quantities of interest. So even though we have a 2-dimensional parameter space and 2 outputs, this is a highly nonlinear map. We cannot guarantee uniqueness of the solution to the inverse problem if it's nonlinear. We can guarantee uniqueness for a given initial, and we have stability. But if you choose a different initial, you could get a different answer to the problem. This particular application has a couple of different approximations, the discretization, time stepping, and then the actual surrogate model. But you can see here is the, we use a data generating distribution and see if we can recover it. So this is actually the distribution in the parameter space. It pushes forward to this, and we use this as the observed distribution. So then the question is, can we collect enough data to recover it? We do a relatively decent job. This is not a terrible kernel density estimate of that density in the input space, and you can see it pushes forward to the observed density pretty well. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and now I'm going to talk about a topic that's it's been a hot topic, arguably for like 40 years, but it's been a hot topic especially lately, and it's this concept of digital twins. So this is a figure I got from one of my collaborators, Tambui, from UT Austin. We've been talking a little bit about building digital twins for extreme weather events. So in this case, hurricanes. You can build digital twins of lots of things. This is really more of a digital shadow, but let's not worry about the distinction. But no matter what you're making a digital twin of, It involves things or concepts like things I've already discussed, like inverse problems, calibration, data assimilation, optimization, control. I haven't talked about OED, but I will in a second. So the question that naturally comes up is, okay, we're interested in performing inference or characterizing a given asset, a patient, or a twin. So if you're doing, if you're at Sandia and you're talking about digital twins, we call these things assets. They're valuable things that are out there. There's perfect analogies to biomedical applications. So you can call them patients if you want, or physical things. The problem is, data is oftentimes limited or maybe not as informative as you would like it to be. Okay? So data could be limited for a number of reasons. It could be destructive. Maybe the data I need to collect requires me to kill the patient so I can interrogate them, or destroy the thing I was trying to assess. Most useful information comes from things like that. Okay, we don't want to do that. But suppose we've done that with a number of related assets. Can we leverage that information? It's almost like a transfer learning problem, but not quite. The question here is, can we leverage information from over the population, from what I like to call digital siblings, to build better priors for Bayesian inference? So this is an extremely simple concept. All I'm going to do is take my population data on things I've already done the intrusive measurements on in the past, use those to construct a population-consistent prior that I'm then going to use for a patient or asset-specific diagnosis. And in theory, if my solution to my DCI inverse problem has constrained the probability density in any way, I should have more informative predictions. Okay? So again, this is very simple. I'm going to fix my initial to be my prior. That's not necessary, but the notation gets a little messy. And suppose we're given a likelihood for Bayesian inference. So again, standard Bayesian posterior, prior times likelihood divided by some constant. If we first solve a data consistent inverse problem and use that updated density as a population-informed prior, then this posterior, which I just put a tilde on, is the updated density divided times some ratio. T tilde is a different constant from C, which you can also write as your prior times this ratio times the ratio of this R times the likelihood. So it's just slightly different. There's just that one term that's different, assuming you're going to ignore the constant. Okay. Just to a note on notation here, the data that you've used for your data consistent inversion is typically you want it to be different than the data that you could measure on the patient or the asset. So we have two different maps now. We have the parameter to observable map that we use for the data consistent inversion, and then the individual parameter to observable map for each individual. You expect to see the most benefit in doing this process if these two maps are informing orthogonal directions in your parameter space. You can think about the Bayesian inference, no matter how much data you collect. If you're doing Bayesian inference, if your map is only informing certain directions in your parameter space, then there's always going to be an ill-posedness or an undefined dimension. There's a lack of identifiability. If we can constrain that direction using population data, that's when this is going to be most beneficial. Okay? Let's go back to this linear Gaussian case, because we can say things in linear Gaussian case, and it's again, I find it very intuitive. So we can characterize the inverse of the covariance of the posterior distribution. This is a standard thing you would always have in Bayesian inference. Now we have the same thing, same two terms, plus some additional terms that come from our updated distribution. You've seen these before, actually. Okay? We can actually prove a couple of things associated with this. We can prove that if the maps are linear and the distributions are Gaussian, then the determinant of the uninformed, the standard Bayesian, and the trace of the standard Bayesian inverse of the covariance are less than the informed counterpart. Okay, so it's useful in certain contexts. If you do OED, things like determinants and traces are important. Okay, just to give you an example, we have a given map. It's a 2-to-1 map, so there's one dimension that's not constrained. We have a given observed density. We have some sort of initial or prior, and we have some sort of individual map which informs the other direction. Okay. You can just write down what these posterior covariance matrices are. They're not that interesting to look at the numbers, but if you look at the determinant and the trace, the population informed has a larger determinant, larger trace, therefore reduced uncertainty in certain ways than the standard approach. You can also just look at these things. This is the standard posterior, standard Bayesian posterior. Here's the population-informed posterior. The scales are different, but you can see this one's much more compacted. That's for the covariance. If you actually want to say things about the information gain, this is actually a negative result, by the way. We can't prove it. In fact, we can disprove it. We thought we'd be able to say that there's always information gained in doing this. It turns out that's not the case. It depends on the realization of the data, even for linear Gaussian data. So in this case, because we were informing different directions, we always see an increase in the relative increase KL divergence, which is the KL from the prior to the informed posterior minus the KL from the prior to the standard Bayesian posterior, normalized by something or other. You can see it's always positive in this case. However, it's not guaranteed if the individual is out of distribution. If you're using population data to inform your prior and then trying to apply that to someone who's out of distribution from that population, this might not be the right thing to do. Okay? This is what happened. You see, in this case, this is actually using the same map. And this is actually the only case where we've observed this so far. For the most part, we get an increase in information gain depending upon the realization of the individual. Sometimes you don't. It's also interesting to see where the don't come from. Here's the observed is in purple. This is the initial prediction in blue. You can see that for the individuals that gave the blue over here, they're marked in green over here, it came from one of the tails of the observed distribution. So either they were out of distribution one way or the other. This is actually numerical error. This is actual real error. Okay. Just to look at a more realistic example, this is a problem, a three-dimensional linear elastic model, standard constitutive relations. We impose a prior on Young's modulus and Poisson ratio based on known properties of stainless steel. We use standard relationships to map these to the parameters that actually appear. This is just a nominal realization. So what's going on, these are those dog bones I showed before, by the way. We have machines at Sandia that come along, they fix them down here, and they grab them and pull them to their base. So what's going on here is the displacements are fixed at the bottom. We're applying an upward force on those faces. Here's the Y, what is this? The X displacement, Y displacement, which is larger as you'd expect, and then the Z displacement, and this is the bonding stress. So we consider a couple of different quantities of interest, one for a population, one for the individual. And you can see that the Bayesian posterior looks like this. It's not bad, actually. This is a KDE approximation of it. But you can see that the use the population-informed posterior. It's much more concentrated, and in this case, you get a 90% increase in the information. Okay. Last topic. Anka, how much time do I have left? Okay. I can go through this relatively quickly. Suppose optimal experimental design is useful when you have the options of collecting different observed data, and you just don't know what experiment you want to do. Not all experiments are equal. Not all are providing unique information. So you want to choose the experiments that provide unique information relative to what you've collected before. And you'd like to do it to either inform model inputs or your predictions. The point is those are actually different. So let me go through this actually relatively quickly. I've already talked about KL divergence. That's one way to measure information gain. Problem is you don't have data yet, so you have to define the space of candidate data and then integrate over that space. So take the expected value with respect to some probability measure over some space of candidate data to compute expected information gain. And then you try to maximize, find the design or the experiment that maximizes the expected information gain. That's standard. This is standard Bayesian OED. There's different ways in which you might do this. It can be expensive, but we can amortize the cost by ahead of time. Okay. Let's go into, you can also do this for predictions. I said I was going to use a lot of pictures for this, and this is exactly what I meant. You have some sort of observation, and you have some sort of prediction. Now, I make some sort of, I collect data on my observable, and that constrains my prediction. This is good. Suppose I take a different observation, same prediction. I collect some data on this observation. You can see I really have not changed the distribution of my prediction. So even though this experiment might be as useful as this one, if you're looking at your observable or your parameter space, it's not as useful for your prediction. That's the whole point. OED for parameters is different for predictions. It might be informing different dimensions of the parameter space. I'm going to go through the notation. It's almost the same thing. You just have to define things slightly differently. Again, linear Gaussian, you can make some key points. The key points here is that this prior weighted map strongly influences the effect of the OED, regardless of whether you're doing Bayesian or DCF. Okay, a couple of simple examples. Actually, I'm going to skip this example. Let's go to this one. This is just laminar Navier-Stokes, steady state. We have some objects. We don't know where they are. We can either we can measure at these points. We can either measure for the purpose of finding out where they are, or we can measure for the purpose of informing pressure drop along these other objects. Turns out different measurements are more useful than others. So here's just what these elevations look like. If you're interested in figuring out where these objects are, you probably want to make measurements. The color's not showing up here, but you really want to make measurements around here. If you want to design or make measurements so that you can predict these pressure drops, you want something upstream. That all makes sense. Okay, so almost everything we do at Sandia, we think about not just the forward simulation, but moving beyond forward simulation. I talked about large-scale optimal design and control. Inverse problems where the solution is just a pullback probability measure, which is data consistent, which borrows ideas from Bayesian inference, but it's fundamentally different. But you can combine these two things together, and you can do optimal experimental design as well. So just some references, a couple I'll point to. The paper with Anka should appear soon in IJEQ. The paper on the population-informed priors should be on archive later this month. I want to thank funding, various sources, and thank you all for your attention. I can repeat the question. Okay, so the question is for the cloaking application. I alluded to the energy constraints that might be required to actually hide the source. So typically they kind of have to be equal. So that's one of the constraints. That's one of the reasons why cloaking actually doesn't work that well. Is you have to oftentimes generate. It depends on how you measure the energy, but you oftentimes have to generate enough to balance what's being emitted. So yeah. Yeah, so the question is, for the metamaterials, is there any opportunities to do homogenization where you can leverage a representative patch of information and homogenize? You use either theoretical or computational homogenization with the high fidelity model to solve a multi-scale type simulation. We thought so. That was actually one of our initial project goals, was to, because the whole Mr. Hyde actually stands for multi-resolution. So we thought we would be able to do a multi-resolution simulation where we hybridize, or we implicitly homogenize the material properties. That didn't work. So the reason why it didn't work is, for one, theoretical homogenization does not work because there's no separation of scales. There's those little nanostructures. They're not really that much subwavelength. It's like 0.6 or 0.7. So if they make them too small, they're not effective. If they make them too big, then you get resonance. So we have to go with what they can manufacture for us. So we weren't able to do theoretical homogenization. Computational homogenization was an option, and we looked into it. But it turns out it was just more expensive because of the scales of the problem. Just actually resolving everything is only like maybe 1.5 times more expensive than the coarser scale model to just propagate a wave in free medium. So we don't do that, but we wanted to. It was actually my role on the project was to do multi-scale or homogenization methods, and we pivoted because it just wasn't the right thing for that particular problem. No, there's other metamaterials where that is the right approach. It just has to do with the relative scale and the relative cost of actually doing it. It didn't work for this problem, but others are more appropriate. Yeah. That is correct. So I'll try to repeat the question. So you want to find the next experiment you want to make, but you need to figure out whether or not the observed data that you want to collect, which you're trying to decide what observed data you're collecting, is going to be sufficiently correlated with, not quite correlated, but we do that in the paper. We should compare with correlation. But if it's not well correlated with the thing you want to predict, then it might be very informative for parameters. You might be informing certain parameters really well, but what you want to predict might depend on other parameters. So you can think of this like as a sensitivity analysis type thing. We're not using sensitivity analysis, but that's kind of the point. Yeah. It's not really a constraint. What we actually do is we solve these inverse problems, and we see what the effect was. So I did skip through that part really quick. So a full Bayesian OED, which is really what we're doing here, just kind of adapted for the data consistent framework, requires solving a lot of inverse problems and then doing optimization around that. So computing the expected information gain requires a lot of inverse problems. Optimizing the expected information gain is the optimization around it. So it's very expensive. We were able to save the cost by playing some tricks. But by doing that, by actually solving the inverse problems and then propagating things here and there, we can compute these KL divergences and actually assess it without resorting to something like sensitivity analysis. Yes, you have to be given that mapping. So that mapping is the same. Yeah. So we have to know that map. We're not choosing what we want to predict. That gets way too complicated. Yeah. Hmm? Yep. Yes. Let me see if I can rephrase the question. In the context of the additive manufacturing, which additive manufacturing itself involves a lot of complicated processes, and even the laser rasterization pattern matters. Can you figure out a way to optimize that for the purpose of having better predictions? Is that kind of what you're asking? I think you could. We have not. Partially because we have these facilities. All those things were made at Sandia. We have the ability, and we have lots of different additive manufacturing things. It's actually kind of hard to build computational models for some of them. Some are doable. The lens, not so easy. Powder bed fusion is a little bit easier. It's a simpler powder-based model where they use what is it? It's smooth particle dynamics so you can actually approximate these things better. These models are terribly expensive, and they're very complicated in themselves. And so we haven't really made the effort to try to go all the way through informing the design process or the build process. Other people have tried it from other perspectives, but we haven't tried it. It's a good idea. But yeah, we just haven't tried it. Yeah, Dakota. The question was, I have worked on Dakota in the past. How does Dakota, which is this meta library, connect with some of these algorithms? So there actually isn't. It's kind of like a secret menu item. There is a data consistent inversion in Dakota. It's connected with all their surrogate modeling capabilities. So actually, the stuff in utilizing approximate models with sparse grids that was done through Dakota. Most of the time, I suggest people just implement it themselves in Python because, like I said, it's only like 10 lines to really do the basic stuff. And then once you understand the basic stuff, you can go to something like Dakota. But you know, in the context of digital twins, it just depends on what you want to do. Dakota itself is really just it's a library that seamlessly connects, and this is non-trivial, but seamlessly connects other libraries together. So you can do optimization with a surrogate model, or you can do design of experiments, things like that. So it really depends on what you want to do in the context of digital twins and whether or not Dakota already enables it. Dakota has actually a pretty good support team. So if something's not quite hooked up right, they can help. So there's connections with pieces. But I would argue that not everything you'd want to do in it with a digital twin can be automated right out of the box. With Dakota, or probably any library, really, it requires a little bit of work. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question is, in scenarios where you detect a violation of predictability assumption, meaning your model can't predict all your data, do I have any experience in fixing this? And actually, and in fact, the very first example we did at Sandia had exactly that characteristic. It was a thing that they were building, and it involved putting together things with joints. They had a joint model. Not add joints, but model for the joints in this mechanical thing. And they would put it on a shaker table and measure the vibrational response. And certain characteristics of vibrational response, like the peak and then the decay, are predictable, and so those were quantities of interest. And then they gave us a computational model for this, and it turns out all of our measured data was over here, and all of our model data was over here. So what I did was I solved an optimization problem and said, give me the parameters that'll put me over here. And then I defined my input parameter space so that I could match the observed data. Now that was useful for the modelers themselves, because they didn't know. They weren't really paying that close attention to how well the model they gave me, at least, was predicting their data. Once I did that, it was trivial to solve the inverse problem. So that's one way in which you can do it. The issue there is it wasn't necessarily model form error. It was, well, probably was some of that. But we were able to kind of alleviate that by changing our parameter space and just using a different regime. But in general, it can become very complicated to understand why your model is not predicting your data. There's many sources: discretizations, model form error, parameter space. Every problem is different. So, yeah. Thank you.